This is one of the few cases I was asked never to reveal, but silence has never stopped the truth. If you've been here before, you already know what that means. If this is your first time, listen closely.
Case File 07, The Real Exorcism of Anneliese Michel.
This is one of the few exorcism cases in modern history officially recognized by the Catholic Church and condemned by the state. A conflict between medicine and faith so violent that left a young woman dead, 2 priests convicted, and the country divided between reason and belief. Her name was Anneliese Michel. Born in Liebelfing, Bavaria in 1952, she grew up in a devout Catholic family, intelligent, disciplined, deeply religious. Those who knew her described her as shy, meticulous, and fragile, but never unstable. Her life would change in 1968, the year she experienced her first seizure. Doctors diagnosed temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and emotional disturbances. Medication followed: Dilantin, Tegretol, Aolept, each prescribed to control the episodes that began to dominate her teenage years. But as the symptoms persisted, something else began to emerge, a growing conviction that her suffering was not purely medical. By 1973, she was a university student in Würzburg, still under heavy treatment but increasingly despondent. She spoke of black figures at night, of voices condemning her. Her roommates reported sleeplessness, muttering, and spontaneous convulsions during prayer. A psychiatric evaluation that year described her as a devout patient exhibiting guilt, delusions, but concluded that she was not psychotic. Anneliese herself began to interpret her condition differently. She believed she was possessed, not metaphorically, but in the literal sense taught by her faith. She turned to local priests for help, but was initially refused. The church required proof, and the proof, they said, was not medical. It had to be spiritual. In 1975, after 6 years of medication, seizures, and unrelenting despair, her family found a priest willing to listen. Father Ernst Alt. He wrote to the Bishop of Würzburg, stating, "She does not look like an epileptic. I have seen many cases. She looks truly possessed." What followed would become one of the most documented and disturbing exorcisms of the 20th century. But before the rituals began, a single line was entered into the diocesan file, a line that would define everything that came next. Permission granted for the rite of exorcism according to the Ritual Romanum 1614. The medical record of Anneliese Michel is as extensive as it is tragic. From 1968 to 1975, she was examined by more than 6 physicians, neurologists, psychiatrists, and general practitioners, each of them convinced that what afflicted her could be treated. And for a time, they believed it was working. Early EEG scans from the neurological clinic in Würzburg confirmed abnormal activity in the temporal lobes, consistent with epilepsy. She was prescribed Dilantin, a common anticonvulsant. Her parents followed every instruction, every dosage. But the seizures returned, first monthly, then weekly, then without warning. By 1970, the physical symptoms began to mix with something else: deep guilt, loss of appetite, and self-punishment. Anneliese wrote in her diary, "I feel like I'm drowning in sin, even when I haven't done anything." Doctors called it reactive depression, a psychological response to the burden of chronic illness. At the psychiatric hospital of Würzburg, she met Dr. Richard Roth, who noted in his report, patient exhibits strong religiosity and obsessive guilt related to prayer. No indication of psychosis. He recommended continued medication and therapy. But therapy was not what Anneliese sought. She wanted understanding and redemption. Her religious convictions were not a symptom to her. They were the only framework through which she could interpret the suffering. Her condition worsened through 1973 and 1974. She reported hearing. voices that mocked her during prayer, whispering, "You're damned, and you will burn." At times, she said the ground beneath her feet felt unnatural, her own body inhabited by something hateful. Friends described her as thin, withdrawn, yet strangely lucid when speaking of God. Multiple doctors recommended hospitalization, but her family, devout and exhausted, insisted on treating her at home. They believed hospitals had failed her. In one of the last clinical reports before the church became involved, a psychiatrist wrote, "No evidence of psychotic breakdown. Symptoms likely rooted in deep religious guilt and neurotic suffering." By late 1974, she stopped attending university. Her weight dropped dramatically, and she refused food for days at a time. Neighbors later said they heard her praying aloud at night, kneeling on frozen ground for hours. She told her parents she could no longer enter the church, that the floor burned her feet and the crucifix repelled her. Medicine had exhausted its vocabulary. And in that silence, faith began to speak. By early 1975, the Michel family had exhausted medicine. Anneliese's seizures continued, but what frightened her parents most were her nightly screams, her refusal to eat, and her violent reaction to sacred objects. They turned, finally, to the church. Their local parish priest, Father Ernst Alt, listened to their account and visited Anneliese personally. He found her emaciated, bruised from kneeling, her hands cracked from constant prayer. During his first encounter, he claimed she spoke to him in a voice not her own. Later, in correspondence with the Bishop of Wurzburg, Alt wrote, "She cannot drink holy water. She cannot step into the church. When I offer the cross, she turns away violently." Alt's observations were submitted along with a formal request for exorcism. The diocese responded cautiously. Under church law, the Ritual Romanum of 1614 required moral certainty that the symptoms were not medical. For months, church authorities hesitated. Several priests examined Anneliese, performing minor blessings but not the full rite. Each left unsettled. In one recorded statement, a visiting cleric noted, "When we prayed the Our Father, she could not say the words, 'Deliver us from evil.' Her body stiffened, her lips froze, and her expression changed." I have no medical explanation. The church requested an updated medical report before proceeding. Dr. Roth's notes were clear: no physical improvement despite therapy. Continued auditory hallucinations. Possible psychogenic cause, but not schizophrenia. It was enough for the bishop to conclude that medicine had failed. On September 24th, 1975, Bishop Joseph Stengel of Wurzburg authorized the ancient rite of Exorcismus Magnus, the Great Exorcism, to be performed by fathers, Ernst Alt and Arnold Renz, a priest experienced in ritual theology. They were instructed to keep records, audio, and notes of each session. The first exorcism took place on September 24th in the Michel family home in Klingenberg. Witnesses said Anneliese reacted violently the moment the prayers began, her voice shifting in tone and language. She spoke at times in German, Latin, and phrases resembling old dialects. Alt noted, "There were moments of lucidity between the fits, brief intervals when she would weep and apologize, saying she didn't want to hurt anyone. From that day forward, the line between treatment and faith was erased. The church called it salvation. The state would later call it negligence." The first session of the exorcism of Anneliese Michel began on September 24th, 1975, in her family's modest home in Klingenberg am Main. It would be the first of 67 sessions, recorded over 10 months, following the ancient formula of the Ritual Romanum. Each began the same way. Father Arnold Renz opened with the Litany of the Saints. Father Ernst Alt stood by, holding the cross and reading scripture aloud. Anneliese's parents and sisters were often present. A tape recorder, placed discreetly near the table, captured every sound. The recordings are difficult to listen to. They reveal no cinematic horror, only exhaustion, struggle, and moments of human confusion. Annelise's voice shifts between prayer and growl, at times pleading, at others mocking the priests. In one tape dated October 10th, 1975, she shouts names that the priests interpreted as demonic: Judas, Nero, Hitler, though later analysis suggested the voices overlapped with symptoms of dissociative behavior. Between sessions, her condition deteriorated. She refused food, slept on the floor, and repeated prayers until her voice failed. Photographs taken that winter show her face swollen and bruised, her lips cracked and bleeding. Despite this, she insisted on continuing. In one recorded moment, she says softly, "I must suffer for others. This is my duty." The priest noted alternating patterns of aggression and clarity. Sometimes she recognized them, apologized, and asked for the Eucharist. Other times she screamed, her words disjointed, her movements violent. Renz later described these changes not as spectacle, but as tragedy, a battle we did not understand. Medical professionals who reviewed the tapes after her death argued that her symptoms reflected psychosis compounded by malnutrition and religious fixation. The church maintained that psychological explanations could not account for the aversion to sacred symbols or her physical strength during convulsions. For Anneliese, faith had become both diagnosis and cure. Every seizure, every cry, every word, proof that she was not abandoned, but chosen to endure what others could not. Her parents no longer questioned it, the priests no longer doubted it, and medicine, by then, had stopped listening altogether. By the winter of 1975, Anneliese Michel weighed barely 70 pounds. Her face was gaunt, her skin bruised, and her knees bore open wounds from hours spent kneeling in prayer. The exorcisms continued, sometimes twice a week, each lasting up to 4 hours. Every session was recorded, cataloged, and labeled with dates and times. Her voice on those tapes no longer sounded like that of a young woman. It cracked, growled, and broke into languages she never studied. At times, she barked, hissed, and spoke rapidly, claiming to be multiple entities. Father Renz documented 6 in total: Judas, Cain, Nero, Fleischmann, Hitler, and Lucifer. Whether these identities were symbolic, psychotic, or spiritual, no one could agree. Her mother, Anna, testified later that her daughter often refused any medical help. She told us that doctors could no longer reach her, only the priests could. By early 1976, Anneliese had stopped eating. She claimed that food was forbidden, that she must fast to atone for the youth of Germany. Photographs from March 1976, entered later into evidence, show her frail body barely recognizable. Her eyes appear sunken, lips torn from self-biting, and her arms thin to the bone. Neighbors said they could hear the prayers through the walls. Latin phrases, followed by screams, then silence. Despite her state, she continued to attend Mass when she could stand, refusing to sit. Father Alt wrote, "There are moments when she seems completely normal. She prays quietly and smiles, as if relieved. Then suddenly, she changes, shouts, and strikes herself. Her family believed she was nearing deliverance. The priests believed they were close to freeing her, but medical experts later argued that she was dying of starvation and exhaustion, the byproduct of continuous fasting and convulsive fits." Her father, Joseph, told investigators, "We thought we were helping her." She begged us not to call a doctor again. By May 1976, she could no longer walk without support. The final recordings reveal a rasping voice repeating the same phrase over and over: "Please, let me go. Pray for me." Within weeks, her organs would begin to fail. The exorcisms continued. By the last week of June 1976, Anneliese Michel was no longer able to stand. Her knees had collapsed from repetitive strain, her voice reduced to a rasp that barely reached a whisper. The exorcisms, however, continued. Fathers Alt and Renz believed they were witnessing the final confrontation, the moment the entities would leave her body. On June 30th, they performed what would be the 67th and final session. The tape begins with a faint prayer, then hours of hoarse breathing and scattered words. At one point, Anneliese says softly, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her mother answers, "Yes, my little one, it's all right." Moments later, she adds, "Beg for absolution," to which Anneliese replies, barely audible, "Please pray for me." That night, she refused food again. At dawn on July 1st, 1976, her parents found her lying on the floor beside her bed. She was 23 years old. The official cause of death, determined by forensic examination, was malnutrition and dehydration. Her weight was recorded at 68 pounds, 30 kilograms. There were no traces of medication in her system. The report listed dozens of bruises, open wounds on her knees, and severe muscle atrophy. No evidence of foul play beyond neglect. Her last words, according to her mother's statement to police, were, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her body was not embalmed. The church requested that she be buried quickly. The funeral took place on July 3rd in Klingenberg under heavy rain. Local villagers lined the road in silence. Some called her a martyr, others whispered that it was fanaticism. The priests did not attend the burial. When the tapes were later reviewed by prosecutors, they found over 42 hours of recorded material. The final reel ended with Father Renz's trembling voice reading from the Gospel of John, "And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." But for Anneliese Michel, the darkness had already taken everything. Her life, her faith, and her body became one last testimony to how conviction, even born from hope, can consume the very thing it seeks to save. The trial of Anneliese Michel's parents and the two priests, Ernst Alt and Arnold Renz, began on March 30th, 1978, in the District Court of Aschaffenburg, Germany. The charge, negligent homicide. The prosecution argued that the defendants allowed a young woman to die under the illusion of religious salvation, when medical treatment could have saved her. The courtroom was small, the atmosphere tense. Photographs of Anneliese's emaciated body were displayed as evidence alongside the 42 hours of tape recordings. Journalists filled every seat. Outside, crowds prayed or shouted, depending on which side they believed. Prosecutor Reinhard Mayer stated bluntly, the defendants chose prayer over medicine. They ignored the dying state of their daughter and patient. The defense argued that Anneliese's condition had gone beyond the reach of doctors, and that the family and priests acted out of genuine conviction. Defense attorney Erich Schmidt-Leichner insisted Anneliese Michel requested the exorcisms herself. She believed this was her only chance. Her parents and priests believed they were saving her soul, not killing her. During testimony, the court listened to excerpts from the tapes. The deep growls, the broken German, the invocations, all played through courtroom speakers. Some jurors wept, others turned away. Medical experts testified that the recordings reflected dissociative identity disorder, worsened by epilepsy and starvation. Dr. Lothar Gresser, a neurologist, summarized, her condition was entirely explainable within psychiatry. The failure was not medical, it was moral. The church distanced itself quietly. No officials attended the hearings. The Diocese of Würzburg maintained that the priests had acted under personal responsibility. After 11 days, the verdict was delivered on April 21st, 1978. All 4 defendants were found guilty of negligent homicide. Each received a 6-month suspended prison sentence and 3 years of probation. The court acknowledged that their motives were pure, but their actions fatally misguided. When asked if they regretted their decision, Father Renz replied softly, if she were alive, she would say she was saved. The prosecutor closed the file with a final statement. No miracle was found here, only a tragedy made holy by misunderstanding. After the verdict in 1978, the case of Anneliese Michel did not fade into silence. Instead, it spread through newspapers, universities, seminaries, and eventually cinema. For some, she was a warning, for others, a saint. Within a year, her grave in Klingenberg became a site of pilgrimage. Visitors left rosaries, candles, and handwritten prayers, believing Anneliese had died as a victim soul, someone chosen to suffer for the sins of others. Local priests discouraged the practice, but the faithful kept coming. Her parents maintained the grave until their own deaths, always refusing interviews, saying only she wanted to save souls. In 1984, following requests from believers, Anneliese's body was exhumed. Officials reported advanced decomposition but noted less decay than expected. The church dismissed the observation as natural variance, but the story reignited public fascination. Photographs from the exhumation, never officially released, circulated through underground magazines and early paranormal books throughout the 1980s. Meanwhile, scholars and psychiatrists studied the tapes as a case of mass suggestion, a perfect storm where illness, belief, and guilt converged. Theologians saw it differently, a mirror reflecting modern humanity's struggle to reconcile faith with science. The case became mandatory reading in some German seminaries under the title Possession or Psychosis, the Michel Question. Then came 2005, when Hollywood transformed the case into the Exorcism of Emily Rose. The film revived interest worldwide, but distorted many facts. Anneliese's story was reduced to allegory, faith versus skepticism, stripped of her real suffering. Her family objected, saying it was never a story to be sold. Today, the tapes remain in the archives of the Diocese of Würzburg, sealed and rarely accessed. Researchers who have heard them describe not demons, but despair, the sound of a body and mind breaking under the weight of faith. Outside her hometown, a simple cross still marks her grave. The inscription reads, "Lord, have mercy." More than 4 decades later, her name still divides the world. Was she possessed or abandoned? Was she chosen or failed? In the end, perhaps the answer is neither. Perhaps it is what lies between belief and doubt, the silence that both sides refuse to face. Nearly 50 years after her death, Anneliese Michel remains a name suspended between theology and medicine. Her story has been dissected in psychology textbooks, debated in church councils, and whispered in seminaries as a modern parable of faith's most dangerous edge. To neurologists, she represents a failure of care, a case where epilepsy and religious guilt were mistaken for demonic possession. To theologians, she stands as a warning of how belief, once absolute, can consume its believers. To her family, she was simply a daughter who wanted to be good in a world that misunderstood her suffering. In 2005, when asked about the ongoing fascination with the case, psychiatrist Dr. Arnold Renner summarized, "Anneliese Michel was not a saint or a lunatic. She was a patient lost between two systems that refused to listen to each other. That remains the most haunting truth of all. Not the recordings, not the rituals, not even the death, but the silence between two institutions that each believed they were saving her. The doctor spoke the language of neurons and trauma. The priest spoke the language of sin and salvation. And somewhere between those vocabularies, a human being disappeared. The church never revoked its stance. The Vatican today still lists the case as an instance of misinterpreted possession. Yet unofficially, priests study it as a cautionary tale that not every cry for deliverance demands an exorcism. In 2013, the Diocese of Würzburg quietly renewed restrictions on performing exorcisms without explicit medical approval. It was called the Michel Directive, though the church never acknowledged her name publicly. What remains of her are fragments, a handful of tapes, a few pages of diary, a cross weathered by rain, and a question that outlived her: when faith and medicine fail together, who speaks for the soul? There are no ghosts in the recordings of Anneliese Michel, no whispers from beyond, no supernatural voices. Only the sound of breathing, uneven, human, mortal. And yet, it is that very sound that unsettles the most. In medicine, death is a measurement. In faith, it is a threshold. For Anneliese, it became both. A life caught between the vocabulary of doctors and the language of prayer, between electrodes and exorcisms. The files remain locked now, sealed by time and discretion. The priests are gone, the house quiet, the tapes resting in an archive where dust has become its own kind of mercy. But sometimes, in the stillness of old hospitals and empty churches, stories like hers surface again, not as hauntings, but as reminders. Reminders that belief can heal. And belief can kill. In the end, Anneliese Michel was neither a vessel of evil nor a sage of suffering. She was something much more fragile, a human being who believed and was believed in until both those faiths collided and destroyed each other. And perhaps that's what remains most terrifying about her story. Not what was said on the tapes, but what was never said at all. This is Dr. Nocturne, where science meets the supernatural. The clock stops at 2:46 a.m.,